I cannot think of a time in my career where a technology has fundamentally changed the behavior in teams so quickly, right? The things that come to mind are like probably iPhone changed the way we used to take pictures and all of that. Like that was a big shift, right? And then now when you sit in a Waymo, at least you're in San Francisco, you feel that, oh wow, this is truly changing the way I commute. But I think like in the context of my job or a lot of our jobs, we've used a lot of SaaS tools and those have been great, but I couldn't think of like any other technology, at least in sort of my career. I was like, man, this is incredible.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Supra Insider. In this episode, Ben and I sat down with Sanket Kavishwar, Director of Product at Relyance AI. Sanket is a Supra member and probably one of the most active contributors in our new AI Slack channel. And that's why Ben and I were stoked to have this conversation. In this episode, you'll hear how Sanket is changing his team's product process with AI prototyping tools, building high-quality prototypes with B0 in hours instead of days, moving from lengthy PRDs to problem statements and interactive demos, helping PMs communicate ideas visually without design bottlenecks, and speeding up customer feedback cycles and improving team collaboration. Sanket shares practical tips for bringing AI prototyping tools into your company, no matter its size. So if you want to make your product process faster and more cross-functional, this episode offers insights that you can apply today. I hope you enjoy it.
If you enjoy this conversation, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcasting app, follow us on Substack, give us a rating. It'll help us a ton and help future people discover us while also making sure you never miss an episode. Thank you.
What's up, Sanket? What's up, Ben?
Hey.
Hey, Mark. Hey, Ben.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I'm super excited for this conversation. And maybe just to start with some context. So I would say like the favorite like Slack channel probably for Ben and I in Supra is our time-saving AI workflow of the week. And I have to say Sanket's probably one of the most active members in that workflow. Like every time you post something, like my mind is blown of like, wow, I have not thought about how to use these tools this way. And I think you and your company are using these tools, particularly AI prototyping in a very creative way. Yeah, I'm just excited to go deep on that. But yeah, maybe let's start there.
This way we could finally stop DMing each other, Mark, that we need to bring him on the podcast. And we can just get it out of our system for now.
Exactly. And ask all the questions though.
Go for also it. My favorite channel, by the way. I think it's probably a lot of people's favorite channel at Supra.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think the reason is I feel you just learn so much from people the way they use these tools and like their creativity, because I think it's just like they're so horizontal that you can just get a window into someone's brain and then borrow what you like, which is really cool. And also I think it has to do with why we've been doing a lot of these AI podcasts, because I think it's just a lot of fun to learn, and there's actually real tangible productivity gains for people. But yeah, maybe let's start there. How has the way you build product and the way you work with your company changed maybe in the last, 6 months?
Yeah. You know what? I was thinking about this exact same thing in the context of this conversation. And I'm like, I cannot think of a time in my career where a technology has fundamentally changed the behavior in teams so quickly, right? The things that come to mind are like probably iPhone changed the way we used to take pictures and all of that. Like that was a big shift, right? And then now when you sit in a Waymo, at least you're in San Francisco, you feel that, oh wow, this is truly changing the way I commute. But I think like in the context of my job or a lot of our jobs, we've used a lot of SaaS tools and those have been great, but I couldn't think of like any other technology, at least in sort of my career. I was like, man, this is incredible. So coming to your question, Mark, I think AI prototyping has changed literally the way we build products at my company today. If you think of like our standard life cycle, if you will, right? Okay, great. PM has this incredible idea. They spend a week at least writing a PRD that eventually no one kind of reads, but it's probably good for their brains to dump their thoughts. And then you go and talk to a designer and then you do all the brain dump with them. And then they come up with a low fidelity wireframe, or the PM does it themselves. And then you go into product review and you go back and forth. it's like a good at least 1 or 2 week process. I think now it's I give a couple of examples. In a lot of product reviews we do today, not even in a lot, I think every single one, instead of starting from the PRD, we start from the problem statement and then directly get into the prototype. So all PMs, and we use a tool called v0.dev, and they haven't paid me to say this, but it's quite incredible. And all PMs in my company, we use V0. And as soon as a review starts, the first thing that everyone looks at is a prototype once everyone is aligned to the problem statement. And I think that has fundamentally shifted the way we're getting products out to market.
I'd love to. This is such a fertile area to explore. So I have a bunch of follow-ups, and I'm sure Mark does too. So first question I have is, when did that start? So like, how long has this been the case? And the second thing I want to ask, a bit more tactical, which is, what is the pre-work before the meeting? That like, is there like a standardized pre-work, or is everyone kind of doing their own thing to get ready for those meetings? It's super interesting. It's just where my brain went.
I think when did it start? I feel like I was probably on Twitter or X, I want to say 4 or 5 months back, and I started seeing a lot of tweets about v0.dev. And I'm like, hey, let me try this out because we had an upcoming feature coming up, and I was like, let me try this out. So I would say it really got into motion probably a couple of months back, but I started toying around with it probably 4 or 5 months back, and then I started implementing it in my own workflows, and then it caught on in my company at least. And it's actually really fun to see other people starting to use that now. Like, a great example is like my CEO. He's running with some special projects, and he was sharing V0s with the rest of us. And V0 has become almost like a verb in our company. We're like, hey, can you share a V0 of that now? So it's been very fascinating to see it getting adopted so quickly across our team. Yeah.
Maybe some context, like how big is the company and the product org right now?
The product org is lean, I would say. The company, we're Series B. We're a little north of 100 people. The product org is 3 or 4 people right now. So it's a very lean product team. We've got a couple of designers, and our founder is also very involved. Yeah, pretty lean, I would say.
And people are creating V0s regardless of title, like PMs, designers, engineers, the CEO. You're just seeing it happen across all the functions?
I think it's mostly PMs and our CEO right now. Designers and engineers really appreciate the fact that we have V0s. And honestly, like Ben, coming back to your second question, there isn't a lot of pre-work. The only pre-work is anyway what PMs used to do before. Okay, hey, be very articulate about what is it that you want to create. And I think instead of now going through the cycles of, let me translate this for a designer and let us get some low fidelity mocks, now we just translate that into a prompt. And as long as your prompt has enough context, I think it does a pretty good job.
I can already picture someone from the audience being like, yeah, this sounds amazing. There's something very valuable about PRDs and getting all your thoughts in a row. And I think you're getting to this with the problem statement of like actually making sure that we're probably solving a problem worth solving. But do you feel like, is there a trade-off here and like maybe doing less thinking upfront with prototypes? Like, how do you think about that trade-off of like just when you jump straight into V0?
I think that's a good question. I don't think there's a huge trade-off, and I'll tell you why. I think prototyping actually lets you iterate through an idea very effectively, in my mind. So even with a PRD, if I think about that process, like even the first version of the PRD, I feel like me personally, and I think a lot of people I know, at least in the PM community, used to think a lot before getting ink on paper, if you will, right? And that process also takes time. But I think in practice, what I've found now is when I'm really trying to get visual and I see a prototype, I'm like, yeah, this is probably not the best way to do this. So let me go back again and let me edit and tweak how I want to solve this problem. So I think PRDs are still important. I know that's a kind of, it's not a hot take that kill all PRDs. So I think PRDs are still important, especially with the PM to get their thoughts in order. But I no longer think that it's a dependency to start a prototype or to start the feature, if you will. I think you can get started very quickly now.
Just to make sure I'm following so far. So basically, let's say we have a product review on the books for next week, middle of the week, and I'm a PM on your team, and there's some idea that I want to bring and get feedback or make sure we're all aligned in the direction for where we're trying to go. I will spend some time before that meeting, maybe drafting a PRD, but that's not going to be the main artifact that we used to discuss. It's just for me to like document my thinking, but I'll do whatever I need to do to get into V0 and to get into creating some kind of link that I could distribute as either a pre-read, or I could share my screen live during the product review, spend maybe 5 minutes walking people through the problem and then how I'm thinking about one way we could try to solve it by showing a prototype, and then people can react to that, ask questions, clarify. Is that basically like the idea?
Yeah, that is exactly it, Ben. And honestly, there have been times when even it hasn't even taken a week to do all of that. Let's say my product review is on Thursday. On Monday, I start prototyping and I have a pretty good prototype, especially for features where you know what you want to build. Even that time lag I feel like it's just producing day by day.
And do you feel like this process for you guys so far, I know it's only been a couple months or 2, 3 months, but do you feel like you've seen kind of a range of size of project or size of investment that this kind of stands the test for? So both like small incremental changes that people want to make, but also maybe larger changes to the architecture of the product or anything like that? Just curious if there's a sweet spot that you found this to work better or worse for.
That's a good question. Honestly, so far, I think it's been like size agnostic of the project. I'll give you a couple of tangible examples. We were trying to make redo the UX of one specific screen in the system just last week. And when I reached out to our designer, I was like, hey, here's a quick prototype of what I have in mind. Feel free to use this as a starting point, or feel free to come up with your own thing. Like, I just want to convey what's in my head visually so that you don't have to read anything or look at maybe slide deck boxes. So that's one example of a very small feature that I've used it for. And another example that comes in mind is we are building this whole new product line. And a part of building that is validating a lot of these ideas with our customers. And instead of now putting a lot of those things in a slide deck, we're not building a V0 for it. We're like, hey, here is exactly what we have in mind. And we share that with customers. And it's been such a high fidelity way, if you will, to get feedback from customers because they can actually click around on things and they can feel what we're trying to build. And that's been an example where that's a new product line. That's a new thing that we're trying to build. And so it's been pretty agnostic, Ben. It's one of those gifts that keeps on giving, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think the cool thing about the stuff that you shared in the past too is that I think a lot of people, when it comes to AI prototyping, they talk about like how it affects their relationship with design, engineering. But I think what you've shared in the past too is also how it affects the relationship with go-to-market teams as well, right? And so can you share like a couple of examples of how that has worked at your company, of kind of like how, like, why are these like maybe like customer success or sales folks like loving that you guys are using this and how it's helping maybe keep your customers happier?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think that's been actually one of the very surprising learnings for me through the process because intuitively I figured that, well, great, it's a prototyping tool. It's going to help us build products, which is great. But I think the way it's helping us get feedback from customers, validate ideas, even build things that only our customer success teams use, I think it's been quite awesome. So I'll give you a very tangible example, Ben. One of the things that we're thinking through is, okay, how do we express value from our platform and what our customers, when they implement like an enterprise B2B software, 6 months down the road, how do they know that what value they've gotten for their business? So imagine if a CEO of that company wants to question and say, why are we using Reliance? How can we communicate that in a crisp way so that they can use it properly? So the way I was trying that approach before was, hey, let me build a spreadsheet and I'm gonna, have some formulas in there. I'm gonna have a slide deck for customer success. I'm gonna train them on this. Bring me to your QBRs and let's talk about all of this. And then at some point, a few months back, I was like, let me actually try V0 for this. So we created like a prototype, like a full-blown prototype where someone can come in and input sort of metrics, and then the prototype does all the calculations, and it gives you a very fancy sort of dashboard, if you will. And the reason it's better than a spreadsheet in that way is because I was in customer success before, by the way, so I'm very familiar with quarterly business reviews and creating decks and all of that. Because it's a fancier looking thing, I can quickly screenshot, put it in a deck, and then share it with a customer, or even share the link eventually. So I think that's one example where I'm like, wow, I didn't even think about the fact that I can use it for things like this. And now we've trained our CS teams and they use that prototype. And if I extend this a step further, selfishly, the goal for me is if I productize this dashboard eventually, I want to get very rich feedback from customers on it. So we are now spending a couple of quarters on just getting this out, having CS and our customers use it and give us feedback, and then we'll productizing the products. That's been one example where I was very surprised on how it's being used.
Yeah, and I think what's really cool about that example is like, one, I think it just feels a lot more self-serve for those like champions that are, or admins that want to, hey, like that are getting grilled by their CEO. Hey, what is the ROI of this tool? They can just share it, right? You can also probably update that data live as opposed to like having to send a new deck or change the name of like, hey, updated this date. And then the other cool thing too, that I think is kind of, I think like a hidden treasure of these AI prototypes is that you can actually add like analytics, right? And you can actually see how people are using it and where are they getting lost and what buttons are they clicking, which then I think can inform, as you were saying, the productized version of it. But Ben, I saw you're going to say something too.
Yeah, I was thinking as a couple things. I think the first one is how it sounded to me something like maybe in a world where you would get by with spreadsheets, so like maybe the previous status quo, if you want to at some point make a transition from using the spreadsheets to productizing, it sounds like pretty much the whole time you're using spreadsheets, you're like kicking the can down the road on figuring out what the product experience should be. But now, because you have this V0, I don't even want to call it a band-aid, but it's just an alternative to the spreadsheet. You're able to set expectations with people that this might not be the production level software that is built in to fit with the rest of the larger product capabilities that they have, but it's a product nonetheless, and it does show the data, or it's at least got screenshots that you can throw into presentations that look like real product. And then they could react to those like they would react to a real product, and then you start to condense the feedback cycles, and instead of kicking the can down the road, now you're getting the feedback earlier. And if people imagine everything that they've been kicking the can down the road on, we're not ready to make that big product investment yet, it's too much. This sounds like a way of getting a lot of that to de-risk the user experience and a lot of those mechanisms.
It absolutely
sooner.
is. And Ben, if I go 4 months in the future now, let's say I've shared that with 20 customers and I've gotten a lot of feedback. And if I've been iteratively improving my prototype at the end of that journey, guess what? I have a great PRD for engineering to build. Like that is a thing that is super visual that anyone can click around, that has already incorporated a bunch of feedback from customers who've actually clicked around in that thing. And I feel like that's been if I really boil it down, at least for me, the ability to click around yourself, I think that's the big game changer. Yeah, you can probably do it with Figma and you can like wire things up and I can click a button, but I think there's still like a psychological block that, okay, yeah, this is a mock. But with prototypes, I think there's a little bit of an unlock, at least in our heads, that no, wait, I inputted a number, it changed the dashboard. There's real logic behind this. And I can click around this, I can truly feel this. And I think that's been like a very major unlock from my perspective with this whole process.
Yeah, the second thing I was thinking, which that's a great segue to, was also kind of like what happens on the flip side of the validation. So let's say you get a bunch of iteration cycles in V0, you get a lot of feedback, you're ready to go to production or graduate out of the V0. Have you guys been doing this long enough to have some kind of like established process for graduating from V0 to like production software? Or and I'm just curious what that is. Yeah.
Not yet, but I think for now, like for the stage of the company we are in, we use V0 more as, hey, here's the end state we want to get to. And so the code it comes up with, like I haven't yet figured out a way to plug that code in with our stack and deploy it as a part of our product. I think that'll happen soon in the future. But for now, we're purely using this as, okay, this is a fleshed out end state, which we were able to get to in a week. And this is what we're going to build. So we kind of ship that as a tactical thing. Like when I create epics and stories in Jira, like the first thing there is, here's a prototype link. And when I kick off a feature, I do the same thing. Here's the problem we're trying to solve. and let's now click. And I'll tell my engineers that this is how it's in my brain, very visual and a visceral way, and then we go back and forth and change it from there.
And one of the things we've talked about a few times in the podcast is like where design and Figma kind of like fits in the process. So do your designers take that end state and try to reverse engineer it with Figma like assets, and then that's the thing that becomes like the source of truth for like the quote unquote developer handoff for implementing production code?
They do. And I think that is honestly one of the things that I would recommend people being very careful about. Is the one flip side to all of this is it could constrain the way people think, right? If I hand a designer a prototype, maybe they would think that, okay, this is the only way to solve this problem. So whenever I do that, I think my general recommendation to my UX team is like, this is one way, this is what it's in my brain. If there's another way to approach this problem, let me know, and then we can sort of iterate on this prototype. And then they use that and build like high fidelity Figma files in our design system that then our engineers can use. So I think that's something I would really recommend people be careful about, because it's a thing that everyone's trying to move fast. And if someone hands you a prototype, you sort of assume that, okay, this is probably the only way to do this. And always questioning that assumption, I think that's important.
Yeah, I think the last thing a lot of designers want is probably someone bringing them a V0 and being like, can you make this look pretty? Or can you like redesign this in our style, our visual language? But it sounds like what might happen in reality is the designers will still have time to chew on the problem, chew on the ideal workflow, figure out how it fits with the rest of the product experience, like the system at large, and which patterns are new, which patterns can be repurposed from other parts of the product. And there's going to be maybe like another meeting that's like the final meeting, perhaps, to review the final designs with engineers. And then that's like the thing that is going to move on the conveyor belt forward to production.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And in some cases, it depends. If it's a small enough feature, maybe you don't need that entire loop. It's like a minor thing. You got to ship it very soon. Then we just skip that whole process, just get straight to, here's a prototype. Mr. or Miss Designer, do you feel this is good? They're like, yeah, it looks good. Let's just implement directly. For big ones, Ben, yeah, that's kind of the process we've been using, is let's prototype, high fidelity design, back and forth, and then it goes to engineering to implement. And honestly, like, my designers are liking it. At least all the stakeholders I talk to in the company, they appreciate the fact that they can get to an answer quickly. I think that's the sort of big unlock that I feel like this has. Is it's funny, like I was doing taxes, which sucks. I was doing that on Saturday. I think it's tax day tomorrow.
It's a great way to spend a Saturday.
Cutting it close.
I live life on the edge. But I was in TurboTax and I was trying to chat with someone, and I asked them a couple of questions. And then they pointed me to like, yeah, you can, why don't you click here or look at this help desk article? And I'm like, man, that's not the answer. I want the answer quickly. And I feel like that's another big unlock from this, is it gets people to the answer faster. So if I use this analogy back in design, they don't have to spend a lot of mental cycles in understanding my writing style and understanding, okay, here's what you actually mean. That I think people really appreciate. And as long as that expectation is set and then you iterate from there, I think it's a pretty effective process.
Yeah, it makes communication and collaboration way more precise, and it removes a lot of the ambiguity. So then you're actually discussing the things that matter. And I think that's like, you're very quickly like up leveling the conversation. I'm curious, why do you think your designers are not using B0 or a similar tool?
I feel like I'm one of the early adopters like you, Mark. So I think it's only a matter of time. I think they will. I mean, I bet Figma will come with a native integration with V0 at some point. You can already upload stuff from Figma into V0 today. So I bet it's about time. Like, I think it's just so new right now that they're just catching up. But fully expect that trend to take shape.
So it sounds like you think there's definitely like leverage for them to use it, but it seems like right now there's no clear path of like, hey, how do I replace how I use Figma today with something like V0 or Bolt or whatever?
I also think a lot of these tools work great when you give them a lot of context as well. And I think today for better or for worse, PMs have a lot of context on, okay, here is truly what I want to solve. And it actually creates a better prototype. I think if designers have that context too, like that's great. I'm fully on board with everyone using V0 or any other prototyping tool for that matter. I think it's a phenomenal addition to the stack.
Yeah, I think that might be a good segue into, I'm sure there's a bunch of people that are listening to this and they're like, hey, maybe I've had an experience with V0 and I haven't gotten very far, or okay, like what you just described sounds amazing, but I haven't been able to get there and smoothly. So maybe can you share like maybe what you've learned in the last 4 months that kind of really have allowed you to get from like that idea or problem statement to a useful prototype in the most like efficient and foolproof way possible?
Yeah. I'll tell you like a small story. But here is like Sanket 4 months back, right? I was getting into V0 and I was like, hey, I need to solve this, create a prototype. Like my prompt was literally 3 lines. And it was cool and it was fun. But then I think I shared this on the Slack channel at one point. I was like, let me do this mini experiment. I live in San Francisco, so I took the bus to get to the office, and the bus roughly takes 45 minutes. So I got on the bus and I was like, hey, deep research, OpenAI deep research. I want to prompt V0 for building this prototype. Here's what I'm trying to do. Here are the 4 or 5 things I need in this prototype. These are like my key requirements. Please also go look at our competitors. Here are a couple of them to get you started, and figure out features that we think I should also add. And then end all of this in a V0 prompt that I can use to prompt V0. And it was pretty good, I would say. So deep research did a bunch of research. It came up with this almost like a blog post of sorts.
By the way, you're doing all of this in your phone?
In,
Is that
in my phone on the bus, by the way, I'm still in the bus. So I'm doing this in the bus. Deep research came back a pretty good thing. Then I just took that and I asked 4.0 that, hey, actually, why don't you create a V0 prompt out of this for me? So 4.0 did that for me eventually. Deep research is like still very research oriented. So I think a lot of that PRD styles and prompts are also like very verbose. So by the time I got to the office, 45 minutes later, I had a pretty solid prompt of V0. And then I got into the office, I fed that into V0. It was pretty big, so it did flounder in a couple of ways here and there. But then I asked V0 that, hey, since you're not able to build this whole thing in one shot, why don't you break it down into logical components and then let's start implementing feature by feature? And it's understood that, okay, here's logically what you're trying to do. Let me build this first feature first. And it did that. And 60 minutes more, I had a pretty legitimate prototype for I would say like a pretty big feature. So going back from all of this story, Mark, to your question, I would say what I've really learned is you can hack your way through a prototype very quickly, but it won't exactly get you what you want. So use other AI tools to prompt other AI tools. And I think that strategy has been working so well for me. And once you give a lot of context, I think like V0, for example, does a great job.
Yeah, just to recap, what I heard was, first of all, it's like wild that you just were able to do all of that on your phone. Like that just like completely changes like how you could PM like from like a poolside, like with a margarita and still like ship stuff, which is freaking wild. And I'm sure maybe there's some people out there who are doing that and you're winning live right now. So kudos to you. But it sounds like one, it's just using AI tools to help you get like a really good prompt and a lot of really rich context, right? Could be deep research with competitors. And then once you have all that information, then also using research to format that in a way that is optimal for the tool that you're going to be using, V0, Bold, whatever that is. And then the second part that's important too is encouraging those tools to break down that prompt into features. So then it builds on top of each other instead of trying to get it perfect in one shot. Is there anything that we missed there that you think is also important?
No, I think you got it right. I guess the other thing I'll add now, I learned from experience is if, for example, let's say V0 prototypes become very bloated, eventually it's better if you just fork that block and then start from that forked version to a new prototype, because I think the context window keeps getting longer and longer, I think, and it starts literally getting a little slower, at least from my experience. So even V0 recommends that you just fork the block if it gets too long. Even ChatGPT does it. So that's the other thing I would add. Yeah.
And I'm curious, have you guys found a way to almost like, so let's say I'm imagining 4 PMs on your team and everyone's putting together V0s. Is there any like centralized like context that everyone inherits from a single place that you've established or anything like that?
Ben, I wish we were so put together, but we don't. But we do have a common project in V0 itself. So everyone can see each other's prototypes essentially. So this is like a V0 thing where if you're on one of the team plans or something, you get a common repository and a common project. So if I tomorrow build something, like my fellow PM gets to see that prototype in the project itself.
And then
It
if they
kind
want to
of,
riff, if they want to riff
yeah,
on that, they can just fork from your latest version and they can play around and be like, actually, here's like a different way I was potentially thinking this could work. That is that happening?
exactly. It is up. Like literally yesterday, one of my customer success team members said, like, hey, I saw that prototype that you built for us. I actually want to add one more block there. And from an implementation I'm doing, I want to add some context from that implementation. So when a customer looks at the dashboard, they get all the context. I was like, great, let me fork that block for you. And you can play around as much as you want.
Yeah.
So it is
This is a
happening.
good this is a good moment to plug something that I've just been doing religiously since Colin Matthews mentioned this on the podcast, which is Colin also always adds I have a text expander, a shortcut for this, but every time I'm in it's Bolt, but I'm sure it would probably work just as well in V0. I have a prompt I append to the end of every single message I send in Bolt, which is don't write any code, walk me through your plan first. And what that does is it always allows me to align with the tool before it goes off and does its own thing for a minute or two and lets me just make sure we're on the same page. And it's actually quite good at almost like remembering the agreements that we make. So if we agree on what the steps are going to be, like I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. Do you want me to start with step 1 now? And I'm like, yes. And then it does it. It's like, cool. Does this look good? And if am I ready to move on to step 2? Like it kind of has that memory. I've been super impressed with its ability to do that.
And Ben, was your question more around if there's like that base kind of design that people work from, or more of is there like shared context about the company, they use like their users and the problem they're going after that then everyone can feed from, basically?
I think in the future, in the not that distant future, I think there's going to be satisfactory answers for both, like satisfactory solutions for both of those problems of shared, let's call it verbal context about the organization. But I think there's also going to be a solution for shared visual language. Like it's only a matter of time. So these systems can understand like SHAD CDN or like some of these other kind of like solutions for design system management and components. But yes, that was basically my question. Because my workflow today, if I'm going to prototype a new concept, because there's a couple different products I'm working on right now, is the idea generally starts with a home somewhere. There's like a place where, like you said, Sanket, it might not be the right solution, but it's just where your brain starts. Like maybe here's one place it could go. And so what I like to do is I like to take a screenshot of that part of the product. And that's like the starting point for my Bolt prototype is could you rebuild this in whatever framework makes sense to you that would look like this, right? And then it does it, and it's like, okay, and then I do it again. I said, could you actually make it look more like the screenshot? Just one more prompt gets it to be way closer. And now everything's modular and extensible, right? So it's like, cool. At the top of that screenshot, I was thinking it would make sense to show XYZ data points in a pattern that includes some kind of like icon and like a label and maybe like a body text of some kind that doesn't exceed this character limit. And there should be maybe at most, it should be able to accommodate like this example text. Could you walk me through how you would do that? Don't write any code yet. And then it tells me, oh yeah, yes. And in the section here at the top of the screen, below, like above this section, I would put this thing that has these things in it. I can now code that for you if you want to see what that looks like. And I'll be like, yes, that sounds great. And then, so that's how every starting point for me starts with that visual thing. So yeah, I'd like to get to a future where I could maybe have some different context, like visual context spaces, perhaps maybe, or like I can seed some kind of version of like where the product's at, or ideally it even integrates with a live code base. So I could always just be like, hey, like this page in the product, can I like riff on an idea there? And so, yeah, is this the page you're talking about? And then it renders it like in code. And I'm like, yes, that's the page. Now so if there's just a way to shortcut the starting point to make sure we're starting at the right visual trailhead for the exploration, I think that would be really cool.
That's so powerful, Ben, and I completely agree because I was thinking about this and I'm like, that's a great opportunity for Figma, right? I have my entire design system in Figma today. And what if these prototypes come up with prototypes using my own design system? And that will cut short the time even more. It's like, okay, great. All of our design team has spent so much time building an incredible design system of, hey, here's the components we use, or here are the indicators and labels and whatnot. If these prototypes can leverage that work already, like that'll cut short time even more for a lot of the small stuff that we're building. Like,
Yeah.
that'll
And
be
I think
incredible.
And I think what's really interesting, sorry, Mark, I just wanted to riff on that for a second, is whether the starting point for the explorations would become the Figma or it would be the production code.
Mm.
Because unless I'm an anomaly, every team I've ever worked on has always had some delta between what's designed in Figma and what's ultimately shipped on production code. And if you're trying to find the path of fastest execution or the thing that's going to get engineers to get the idea fastest and get to market fastest in production, theoretically, it's actually better to start with an iterative development on existing patterns and code versus the thing in Figma. So I'm just curious to see how that shakes out and whether there still will be, like, what is Figma's role going to be in all this? Is just something Mark and I think talk about a lot about this.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was going to go to a very similar direction.
Yeah.
Was that, yeah, like, I think that's what's like scary for Figma, right? It's becoming pretty easy to just get an HTML and make it into a prototype. Or so, like, why do you need that design system if you assume that the source of truth is the website? I almost think, like, in order for Figma to be in a really strong position to not be heavily disrupted, they need to, as you said, close the gap between production code and the design system and be very tightly integrated, and then also empower designers and PMs to really prototype quickly so they can get to those like very high quality, high precision conversations way faster. Instead of taking a week or two to build that prototype, you can do it in 1 or 2 hours. And yeah, I would be shocked if they don't announce this in 2 weeks in config. Like, that would be a big shock.
I agree. And I feel like they have so much leverage because so many teams have created this consistency in their design in Figma, right? All these the fact that you have a design system in the first place is for consistency. And I feel like they have that leverage already because here's one pitfall from all this prototyping in my mind is it's great, it works at our scale, but if I'm like I don't know, a Bank of America or like a massive company, you do run the risk of having very sort of disparate product features that you ship if you are not tied to back a common design language. And I think that's where, in my mind, Figma's leverage comes in is they kind of help with that. So I'll be shocked too. I hope they do it. Like, I love Figma, by the way, just for the record. And I spend a lot of time in Figma myself, and I hope they make this process easy.
Yeah, because I think that was where my head was going when you were talking about, how you guys create forks and you have different projects. I was like, version control just sounds like such a nightmare. And
it is.
It's like so hard. Like right now, the way V0 or Bold work, like it's so hard to know. Be like, hey, here's the source of truth. Like you almost need to use a different tool, like maybe a Google Doc or some sort of reference where it's like, hey, this is the latest one, which kind of feels like going back to almost like Sketch, right? Of like you kind of like had like the most like a file like
final V2.
Exactly. Yeah. Basically, that's where in the maturity where we are at. And yeah, I totally agree. I think they have an opportunity to kind of win over big companies, but at the same time, I think they do have to stay connected with the agile small companies because I think those are the ones that are working on the cutting edge, basically.
I think that they just have to be really willing to like cannibalize themselves as where I like the current workflow almost has to go extinct. And and sometimes tools, I didn't come up with this, but I think I subscribe to this notion that the tools you use shape your workflows. They shape how you work, right? Because the tools have constraints and they have happy paths and stuff and defaults. So I just don't think it's almost like we had Will Newton on the podcast and we talked about why Figma is so critical today. And the reason it's so critical today is because there's a lot of like open heart surgery almost is what happens, what I was picturing that you have to do on these designs to get them to production. You have to think through all the edge cases. You have to think through the implementation, the specific borders and the shading and the fonts and the like all these little things like the iconography. And theoretically, if there was a future in which a designer or whatever that role is called in the future can go into the prototype and do open heart surgery in the prototype and like actually make do all the little tweaking that they do in Figma today, but in the prototype, it does beg the question, what is the role of Figma in that world where everything can happen and wherever the prototype lives? And if Figma wants to stay relevant in that world, it seems to me like they have to be willing to cannibalize their own prototyping experience and get into this new world where obviously people want to be, right? I think we're early, but it doesn't seem like it seems like pretty inevitable that this is everyone's going to be working in prototypes in the very soon future.
I think the really, what happens when you become almost like the gold standard for doing something is that then you start landing bigger and bigger clients, and those bigger clients are the ones that have the 7-figure deals, right? They're the ones that like make most of your revenue. So it almost becomes really hard to justify cannibalizing your product, and at the risk of losing maybe like where 60 or 50% of your revenue is coming from. So it's a really tough position, right? It's like, do I like optimize for short term, keeping these big clients, right? Like the Bancos of America or the Apples of the world, or Google, right? Where you have thousands of designers and huge figures, versus maybe like adapting to maybe a way like a Series B company works, even though you know that's actually where the world's going to go. And if you don't do it, someone else will take it. So I do have a lot of empathy because it's like a really hard dilemma. But yeah, I feel like we know how that plays out. We've seen it over and over again.
But you know what? I feel like the good news is that if I'm Figma, like just if I strip everything away, like my main job as a company or as a product is helping bring ideas to some semblance of reality. Like that's what at the end of Figma does. And I think prototyping is just another way to get there. So if I'm Figma, I feel like the core thesis is still pretty strong, right? Like people want to do that. Now there's this another way to approach that same outcome. And I hope they like. I bet they'll add. I agree, Mark. I bet they'll release something in config, because I don't think this is fundamentally different from what they're trying to do as a mission for their product. It's something similar. It's just a different way to get there. So yeah, I agree. I hope they do something.
It's not like science fiction to go from what they have to what I think we all kind of want. And I think if instead of a canvas that you click around on components and each of these things can be like double clicked into, and then there's this panel that shows up with all these attributes and you could modify, if that canvas was like the preview mode in Bolt or V0, and Mark hops into the prototype and I see Mark's cursor going around the prototype just like I see my cursor, and I can click into a component and be like, can we make this? Like I just click into it and then I describe what I want to do with it, or I hover over an area and I'm like, hey, in this area, can I like add this component that says this information? I feel like that's I want Figma and Bolt to have a baby, and I think that's the thing that is like the right experience to have.
There you have it. Whoever's listening, that's the roadmap for the next 6 months. Time to make a baby.
They have to do it.
Yeah.
They gotta do it.
No, I agree. But you know what? I think the other thing that we touched upon a little bit that I also want to touch upon is I don't want people to feel like this is the net new end state today where you can completely run products 100% on prototype. You cannot. I think it's still very new. I agree, Ben, with what he said. There's still so much exploration to do. I really feel like it's another tool set in your arsenal to use to get to an end state faster. That's at least how I look into this and how I use this today. So all these caveats of, even when I explained like the deep research, I, as a PM, I feel like it's still obviously my job to make sure that maybe deep research just looked at 3 competitors and not 6. And if I know some relevant competitors, I still have to do that. So I just want to add a caveat that it is an incredible tool. I totally believe in getting you to an answer faster, but there are certain caveats, and use it. You know what, in Spider-Man, they say with great power comes great responsibility. I feel like it's very true with this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's something that multiple guests have said in the past, that is just, as a PM, it's so important to stay close to that like source, like primary material, either that's customers or actually you going to the competitors and trying the product and getting a feel for it. What is actually feels good, what doesn't. I think there's no substitute for that. And it's almost like you could even argue that's like even more important than ever to do that. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm sure now there's some people that are listening to this, hey, like that actually the state that you currently are living in sounds great, and I'm sure some people want to try it, right? But they're like in square zero. So technically speaking, like how do you, what is the first step? Because I think you cannot just like show up tomorrow and be like, hey, by the way, starting tomorrow, you have to bring a live prototype to all my product reviews. Like what would be the first like kind of incremental step, and maybe like the roadmap for like the first 2 months of you wanted to bring these tools into your org?
Like it's very meta, the roadmap of bringing prototyping to your org. Yeah, I think honestly, like the first step from my experience is try it out yourself. So if you literally are a PM listening to this today, if you are working on a net new feature and if you're writing a PRD today, I would go back, sign up for something like a V0 or any one of these tools. It's free, at least a few prompts are free, and try your idea by prompting in V0 as an example. And that would truly be a first step, is first get familiar with how these prototypes work and how you prompt your way through a prototype. And once whoever is listening, they get a good understanding of, okay, this really captures the ethos of what I want to do. Then introduce that in whatever product review setting you have. Maybe today in your product reviews.
Can I ask
Go ahead.
quick, just to go a little bit deeper? So what is your recommendation? Because I think what I've struggled with these tools myself is that I have really high expectations of how fast I'll be able to make them useful. So like when you say try, like what do you think is a reasonable period for people to be like, hey, like it's going to take X amount of time and you should, like, yeah, like how should people think about patience almost and persistence?
I don't know if I'm the right person. Like my clock speed is generally pretty low. I would say give it 7 days. You will know if it works for you or not. And if you're still struggling after 7 to 10 days, then maybe that's not the right flavor for you and your company and the products you're building. But I'll give you a story of how I got into this. So when I started using V0, I was in a meeting with my CEO and we were discussing some idea in words. And like he shared, hey, this should we experiment with XYZ? And after the meeting, that was literally first day using V0. I just prompted a little bit and I got a visual out of it. And then I went back to my CEO and I'm like, hey, is this what we were talking about? And it was just such a great and high fidelity conversation from that point. So like my yardstick, Mark, honestly, is if you don't see value in the first 7 to 10 days, maybe it's not the right time to be using these tools, because they get the time to value is pretty quick from my opinion. And I'm also over optimistic, by the way, as a person. So take that with a grain of salt, but at least it's been very helpful for me.
But I think that's like really helpful, right? Because I think there's some people that are listening that maybe, hey, if I cannot get something the first 10 minutes, this is not for me and the technology is not there. So I think it's just helpful to see like, hey, we're not talking about like 10 minutes. We're talking maybe like about giving a few tries within a week.
Right. Definitely.
I also would tell those listening who are hesitant, or whatever term we want to use to describe someone who's not all in yet, hasn't had their light bulb moment. I would say that there is, and sure, you could call it just like a perceptual benefit from other people, but if you become one of the first people in your org or your team who starts to show how you could be having better conversations with AI prototypes, that will start to position you as an early adopter or someone that other people will look to as some kind of knowledgeable person about something that is obviously important. And if your organization as a whole doesn't value AI or doesn't think AI is important, that is, I think, more of an indicator that there's an issue with the organization and the organization is going to fall behind. But that's maybe less about you. I can't see how you go wrong by being someone who starts to like bring these prototypes to the conversation, especially if it's like you talk about something and 15 minutes later you show me a version of it that I'm not going to expect it to be perfect. I'll be like, we just talked about this 15 minutes ago. The fact that you have anything that even remotely gets the conversation rolling in a productive direction is going to be impressive.
Sorry, I'll just add one thing, Mark. Sorry, Ben, just think about that construct for a second, right? You have a conversation with someone, they shared an idea. Pre-prototyping world, I'd be like, hey, that's great. Let me write a paragraph about this quickly. And then let me find time on a calendar with my UX person. And maybe I find that for tomorrow or day after. And then I get on the phone with them and then I explain the same thing that I heard. and we then come up with a mock or a prototype or whatever it is, like a low fidelity, and then I go back. Like, just that construct is at least 3 to 4 days, and the fact that it was down in 15 minutes or 30 minutes, that is incredible. And that is why I am so like, I viscerally feel like, oh, our world is changing, like literally every single day. It's crazy.
Yeah. Also, like the cognitive load too, right? Of like, there's just like thinking about every single interaction of finding the right time to approach your designer because they probably have other priorities. Then like making the calculus of like, hey, do I really want to pull them out from this thing that I know they're going to have to deal with context switching, and then they're going to move slower, and then maybe the bar. So like there's all these different like calculations and handoffs and keeping track of different balls in the air that all of a sudden just you get rid of it, and you can use that cognitive power for something else that might be more useful. So I think that's on itself is already incredibly powerful. And Ben, back to your point, like I'm so glad that you mentioned that benefit of adopting these tools early on. And like I actually have a very specific example. I'm not going to say the company, but there's basically a PM that I know that early, like probably 6 months ago, started positioning himself as someone who was an early adopter of these tools, not just prototyping, but also Cursor, and build really cool like automations for the org. And this person now has basically like an hour meeting with the CPO every week. And they're getting FaceTime value with all the BPs. Like this is probably like a 60-person product org, 60 PMs. And I would be very surprised if that's not going to be a huge win for their career, right? Like how do promotions happen at these companies? You get visibility from all the people who are in that calibration meeting, and those used to be like tend to be the BPs, and this person's getting FaceTime value. And this actually it's also like it's one of the easiest way I feel to show wins, right? And have an impact, and that's how you get promoted. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up.
That's so true. Yeah. And I would just
yeah,
add,
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead,
Yeah.
Ben.
No. I'm curious where you're going to go.
Oh, I was just saying, like, I think partly I'm lucky because I'm in a smaller organization and the environment around me is very conducive to doing these things and getting to an answer faster. I think especially with people in big companies, like Mark, going back to your example, I think because there are so many checkpoints and things that are in the way for good reason, by the way. Like, I'm not against process, and I know they exist for a reason. To get from A to B, I think introducing this new way of getting from A to B for maybe a junior PM in a big company, I think that's incredible for their career. And it'll, even especially in a big company, I feel like it'll help them, get up the ranks, if you will, faster.
Yeah, this is actually one of the areas where I think being in a risk averse company at this point in time, or a company that is not at the CEO level pushing people to embrace AI, like on the extreme end of that, I think we recently saw the Shopify CEO. I think it got famous for, what is it? I think he told his team if they're going to hire someone, they have to make a case for why AI cannot do that job to get the head count or to get the budget to hire someone. That's obviously like super high level of conviction from a CEO about we need to embrace AI or else, like, you know. So I think that's obviously the ideal place to be. But there are a lot of bigger companies that I think are going to run into, they're going to get in their own way of adopting these tools. And that is going to be unfortunate. Like if someone can't use their AI tool of choice because IT or compliance or someone gets in the way. But that's the cycle of creative destruction, right? As you win a market, you get really big, you get in your own way, you get disrupted, you die. And
yeah, it's just the universe working.
I know we got really sidetracked from the kind of where we were going, which was like, hey, how do I bring this way of working into my company? I think where we got derailed, and that was my fault, is basically, but I'm glad we did. That was a lot of fun. Is basically you should start using that tool. Give yourself maybe 7 to 10 days, and then once you are using that tool, then what do you do next?
Yeah, I think once you're using that tool, start obviously introducing that in whatever your product review format is. Like, I'm sure, irrespective of what format you follow, there is some place where you review mocks or review prototypes. I would inject the prototype there. That would truly be my like next step. And from there, I should try experiment. Like, if I had to take a step back, another approach for this would be experiment with the small stuff first. So maybe there are certain features you're working on, maybe they've been in a backlog for a while, and you're like, okay, it's a quick win for my product line, let me build this. Instead of following your regular process, just create a prototype, discuss that with your engineering team, and see how that goes. And if that format sort of works, and if your engineer also likes that, then you can start expanding the scope, if you will, and then keep expanding into bigger features, bring them in product reviews, work with design. I think, Mark, I went in a lot of directions, but if I have to summarize, yeah, I'd say use it yourself. Step number 2, bring this in a product review. And step number 3, for a smaller feature that you're working on today, just try this approach and just work directly with your engineer and see how it goes.
Yeah. The reason why I love that quick win thing is it feels a lot lower stakes than a product review, unless you're like the head of product. Then at that point, it's very different. And then maybe like instead of doing with engineers, maybe like you can do what you did. Instead of going to product review, maybe you have a conversation with the CEO and you send him like a prototype. But I think that's a great call out.
I was going to propose one more specific step that feels maybe like it's slightly lower stakes, which is to I've always really valued relationships with designers. Like I think I've gotten supercharged impact out of really good designers, and like to bring them along on the thinking journey always. So I'd say if you have a really close relationship with one of your designers and neither of you have taken the first step yet to like bring AI prototyping into the workflow and the way that you do things, you could reach out and just say, hey, I actually have this thing that I'd like to just use as a test case for AI prototyping. You down to like find 30 minutes with me, and then I'll just screen share and you could just watch how I navigate this, and we could maybe talk through it together, see what works well, what doesn't work well. And now instead of you maybe coming in as like a, sole pioneer in your organization, which maybe some people like, some people don't. Now you're coming in and you're like, hey, like this person and I jammed on this. We created this together. It's actually really powerful. And now it's like, it's a shared artifact that's been created. It's like it's a new way of working that multiple people in the organization have endorsed from the very beginning. And I think that just probably has more benefits, and it makes it feel like everyone's contributing to it, to the learning journey on the team.
Love it. Agreed. Ben, I like how you're like so collaborative with this.
To a fault sometimes. But I do think these tools make it decrease the chance of being collaborative to a fault. Like I think my excuse in the previous days, years ago, for being overly collaborative is like being maybe like worried that I'm going to do the wrong thing, or I'm going to waste my time going in the wrong direction, or I'm not going to do it as well as other people. But these tools have felt for me personally empowering, because if I spend 15 minutes on something and I can come to the conversation a couple steps ahead of where it would be before, then I don't know. For me, it's empowering. I've never been this excited, I think, about the ability to start a conversation in the right point, like the right place.
That's such a good way to put it. And I think I would just underline that. That's all what this is. I think it gives you the ability to start conversations at the right, like on the same page. I think that's such a good way to put it, Ben. And that's true. Like, I don't think these tools are going to replace teams or people at all. Like, at least based on my knowledge right now, I think they have in practice been great for working with customer success, with engineering, with design. Like, I think everyone on these teams appreciate the fact that you're bringing everyone on the same page a little faster. And I think that's a great way to think about these tools. I completely agree with the framing.
Yeah, I think the other reason why I like that too with designers is that I think with this new world, and we've talked about this before, that they're the ones that you're likely to maybe rub the wrong way or alienate or feel like you're like getting into the arena. So I think like the cool thing about going with them first and doing it together is that you're like co-creating this thing instead of you coming to them with a solution and then having that potential ambiguity of, hey, you're stepping in my territory. You didn't like ask for permission almost. So I think that's like the cool thing is like you start the process with someone who is like your ally and someone who like almost you made it think, hey, it's your idea too, as opposed to like me coming to you with this thing that may or may not be putting your role and value add to the company at risk.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's important to remember that the rest of the organization still has to keep in mind, like everyone in the org has, whether they have it consciously expressed or not, everyone's got a mental map of who does what. if I want to talk to this, if I care about this thing, who do I talk to? Who's responsible for the way that this part of the product looks and feels, right? Like everyone's mapping that out in their head all the time. So I think it can be a little destabilizing if you imbue a sense of uncertainty or chaos about who's now, is the PM the person that's like responsible for how this looks and feels, or is it still the designer? And I think the short answer needs to be, it's the team. It's the team that owns that part of the product is still the team that owns that part of the product. How they go about doing their work and how they go about iterating and getting on the same page is evolving. But the who you need to talk to doesn't change. And I think that's the thing that gives people probably a lot of psychological safety, that they're not being replaced, or they're not going to get maybe as defensive and get triggered by the emergence of these tools.
Yeah. That's
the one that...
Yeah, there you go.
Go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's going to be I think this is probably like a timeless principle, but I think like the attribute of like a very like high performing lean team of the future is going to be able to have these like very open conversations of who is responsible for what and under what circumstances can I blur the lines of what you do and I do for the good of like our shared goal, which might be like making our customers really happy. And that's actually maybe like a good segue into this other topic that Sanket, you've also mentioned in the past, of this concept of like, I think we can all agree one of the worst things, or one of the worst asks for engineers from PMs is like, hey, can you change the text in this label, right? Because it just feels like beneath them of this like super smart person all of a sudden has to go into their code and like change like 3 letters, right? And all of a sudden now, like we have the right tools in our hands to do that, and in a very low risk way. I don't see why not PMs could all of a sudden just do a pull request to do that change, and that's totally fine without the engineers. And engineers are probably pumped. They're like, hey, I didn't want to do that in the first place. So yeah. Curious how, I know you've been thinking a lot about that. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sort of betting honestly my time on that trend this year. Like I am creating PRs in my company for very small stuff, and I'm betting my time on that trend. Like in my head, personally, I'm the kind of person who like hates people to ask them to do these things. Hey, can you change this label? Because I think this is the best way to do it. And they'll be like, well, I mean, I think that's the best way to do it. And there's no right answer in certain cases, right? And the trend that I'm betting, at least my money on, is I feel like PMs now have some of these tool sets to truly curate the experience a little more end-to-end than we had before. If I go back to what Ben you said about the sort of the loss in translation, right? What do you actually end up designing in Figma is not the exact thing that comes in production at times. And I think that sort of phenomenon happens just because there's a bunch of human beings, in my view, just doing those things, and there's certain loss of translation somewhere. So I think now we will have the tool sets to at least start curating the very small parts of this experience. Hey, I want to drive more consistency in the way my labels look in the UI for the features I'm responsible for. So maybe let me open a PR and just update the wording on these 5 screens so that they're consistent. That's a kind of chore that I don't think anyone enjoys anyway. And personally, for PMs, that's a great win. That's something that really interests and excites me. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that, Mark. And I think that will be a trend, especially as we hit the end of the year, where PMs will start doing stuff like this.
And it just makes sense. Like it takes longer to write that text or write that Slack message or that Jira ticket than actually going in and changing it, right? Like, which is wild.
Yeah. And I hope, and I bet, I think engineers will also appreciate that, at least based on my very limited sort of data points I have. Because like in my head, it's, you used to use a vacuum cleaner and clean your house manually, and now you bought a Roomba. No one kind of likes to vacuum their house in the first place, but now, at least if I'm an engineer, I'm like, great, I don't want to do those chores anyway. I want to like work on a lot of like meaty stuff. And if you can do that, great, just do it.
And how are you doing this PR request? Are you just using Cursor, or are you just familiar with the code base and you're just using like another code editor? Like, how are you?
I'm using Cursor for side projects, but in my company, like I'm familiar with the code base a little bit, so it's easier. But it's very minor stuff. It's like if any engineers listening to it, they'll be like, dude, that's nothing. so it's very minor.
It's like, do you think that's coding? That's cute.
But even getting to a point where I remember like when I joined my company, it was very early enough where I had some coding experience from a past life. So there were so few people, and so I actually did a little bit of coding in my company. And I remember when I was setting up my machine for my dev environment, man, it took a couple of days to do that. It was so hard. Now I did that again a couple of weeks back, and I was just asking ChatGPT. I was like, "Hey, I got this error. What do you think?" And I and I did that in 3 hours. And I was like, "My God, the world has changed."
Yeah, it's funny. You've got like the perfect PM background if you think about it, like engineering background, customer success background, and now like early into AI as a director of product management. I feel like that level of well-roundedness is pretty rare in seeing PMs that have both the customer success background and the engineering background. That's got to be serving you really well in this moment.
Yeah, I feel grateful and lucky, Ben. Especially, I feel like the customer success experience is underappreciated. I mean, I think a lot of PMs do appreciate it, but just like being in that mindset of, oh, I'm in a QBR, how should I message this to my customers so that it resonates well with them? I think you get so much of that from customer success. So thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
And
Yeah.
then you also have a similar, like you also started in a similar way, right? Like in a customer facing role.
Yeah, I was like finance, and then I was in investment banking, and then I was a failed founder, and then I was in customer support where I discovered product management. That's kind of I kind of came into product management through the customer support org, also at a fast growing company at Life 360. And yeah, I think the moment that customer success, customer support, whoever it is, sales, whoever internalizes the voice of the customer and just like becomes an expert in understanding how people think about the product, like what space it occupies in their head, what are their considerations, what keeps them up at night, that person's going to be pretty well equipped, I think, to have opinions about the product. So yeah, I think customer success is almost like next level. I have a next level appreciation for that because when you're serving 4 or 5 million customers in a consumer company and customer support, there's like a level of like the LTV of a given customer is so small that no one of them has all this like weight that they can throw around. But if you're in a B2B company doing customer success, like sometimes there's a lot more delicate, I think, situations you got to balance.
Agreed. But it'll just bring in, like going back to Mark, your main question, I think it'll actually end up creating better products, right? If we think about some of the best experiences, which could be debatable at this point in time, but like if I think, I don't know, like an Apple phone or a Tesla car, like they're really well thought through experiences because they're just so like, in at least in the hardware world, they sort of control the supply chain, if you will. And I think if I use the same mindset and analogy to PMing, I think this is what these tools give us. Is it lets us, and control is probably not the right word, but curate the experience in a much more consistent way and make sure that people are actually spending time on what they should be.
Yeah, I think it's going to be giving PMs a lot more agency to, I think, implement their taste and follow their gut and not have to rationalize every little decision because they have to convince someone else to do it, right? In a world where you can just do things on your own, it's actually maybe ironically getting us closer to the PM being the CEO of the product than it's ever been before. You don't actually have to ask people for permission. You can ask for forgiveness, but just go for it.
Right.
And then as a user of products, I'm excited to start using products that I can tell were created by someone really opinionated that has a certain like intuition about how they want the experience to be versus this product's designed by committee.
Yeah. I think that the part that's exciting to me is like, yeah, it's the how quickly you can get to a high quality conversation where you're going deep into trade-offs and you actually get to have a concrete like set of opinions back and forth and strengthen each other's thinking, get more solidified. I think the other thing that's like truly powerful here is that if you think about anything in life, right? Like people who are successful, products who are successful, one of the common themes is that they just take way more shots on goal, right? Like they try something, they iterate, they learn, and that kind of gets them to like that end result or success that's amazing. When I think here, that's what you're doing is like you're accelerating like, quote unquote overnight success because you're actually are able to, instead of talk to 2 customers in 2 weeks, you're able to talk maybe to 10 customers, right? And get 10 different types of feedback and further iterate and further get better. So yeah, I think it's really exciting. I think that products are going to get better and I cannot wait to see more preamps using these tools, and hopefully this conversation inspires a bunch of people to start using it more. And I know we're coming close to time, so maybe two final questions for you, Sanket. First one is, where can people learn more about you, the work you're doing? And then two, how can the audience be helpful to you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn or on X. I sometimes post memes, so you can, if you're interested in that, you can follow me
Nice.
there. And I think from the community, I guess like just more tangible examples of how people use these tools across different company sizes. Like I'd be really curious how someone would use this at a size of a Salesforce, let's say. I'd be really curious to know that. So I think trying these tools and sharing your experiences, I think that's key because honestly, that Slack channel, Marc and Ben, that's my translation layer on there's so much stuff happening in AI, or I've lost count of the new model that Google just came up with 2 days back. Like I've completely lost track of all of that. But that channel is sort of a translation layer where people are trying stuff out, and then I get to see, okay, this is what I actually did. So it gets me to the answer faster, if you will. So I think just people using these things and sharing their experiences in that channel, I think that'll be super helpful.
I also feel like the name of that channel being all about time savings is a little bit of a misnomer because I think it's expanded well outside of the scope of time savings.
Yeah, we'll have to do a rebrand, but it's also just funny how it started. Yeah, it brings us back to the OG days. Awesome. This has been an awesome conversation. Cannot wait to share with our audience.
Likewise. Thanks for the opportunity, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on.